The movie opens at a TV studio, where Elizabeth Sparkle, an Oscar-winning actress, hosts a live morning exercise show. After the show, she walks through a hallway lined with posters of herself, while everyone wishes her a happy birthday. She then heads to the restroom, only to find the women's restroom out of order. After looking around, she enters the men's restroom and goes into a toilet stall. Moments later, Harvey walks in while talking on the phone about replacing her, even mocking her because of her age. After overhearing the conversation, Elizabeth is left devastated as she stares at her reflection in the mirror. At the restaurant, Harvey subtly fires her by hinting at her age. However, when she presses him for an explanation, he can't find the right words. Just then, he sees a friend arrive and quickly excuses himself. On the way home, she can't stop thinking about what Harvey said. Then she notices a billboard featuring herself being taken down. Distracted by the sight, another car suddenly crashes into hers, causing her vehicle to flip over. Moments later, Elizabeth wakes up in a hospital. The doctor tells her that she escaped with only minor injuries. Just as Elizabeth is about to stand up, a male nurse stops her. He begins examining her back and spine, leaving her confused. After finishing the examination, he hands her coat back, and she notices a strange birthmark on his hand. She reaches into her pocket and suddenly feels something. She pulls out a USB stick with a phone number written on the back. However, her thoughts are interrupted when an old high school classmate approaches her. It turns out he has admired her ever since high school, and nervously asks her out before handing her his phone number. Soon after, back at home, she quietly stares out at the city, lost in thought. On the table sits a bouquet of flowers with a card addressed to her. Moments later, she plugs the USB into the TV and watches a promotional video introducing a mysterious product called the substance. The video explains how it works while emphasizing the strict rules that must never be broken. However, Elizabeth dismisses it as nonsense and throws it into the trash. She then heads to a bar for a drink, where she watches a young woman with her boyfriend before ordering another shot. Not long after, Elizabeth throws up in the bathroom. As she looks at herself in the mirror, her gaze shifts to all the awards displayed in her apartment. Frustrated, she throws one at her own portrait. She then retrieves the USB from the trash and places an order. The person on the phone gives her an address before abruptly hanging up. The next morning, Elizabeth wakes up, takes a shower, and reads the newspaper. There, she finds a casting ad searching for her replacement, leaving her even more frustrated. Moments later, she checks her mail, finds a card, then checks the address written on her hand. Without wasting any time, she heads to the address. She arrives in a quiet suburban area with no one around, except for the distant sound of barking dogs and ambulance sirens. Before long, she finds the address hidden beneath a staircase. She swipes the card through a reader, causing a shuttered door to open only halfway. Realizing it's designed that way, she ducks underneath and enters. After walking through a dark, narrow hallway, she reaches a spotless white room filled with lockers. She soon finds the correct locker, opens it, and takes its contents home. Inside the package, she finds several medical tools with a detailed explanation of how it works, along with a reminder emphasizing that every step must be followed precisely. That night, while standing in the bathroom and staring at her reflection in the mirror, she finally decides to use the product. She injects the serum into her hand and waits for the effect, but to her disappointment, nothing seems to happen. However, as she turns around, dizziness hits her and she collapses. Writhing in agony, her back begins to bulge as though something alive is moving beneath her skin. Her pupils duplicate themselves, leaving each eye with two different irises. Moments later, her spine splits open down the middle, and a human hand slowly emerges from the opening. Sometime later, she opens her eyes, dazed and disoriented. Beside her lies Elizabeth's body with its back split open. Looking down, she notices that her own hands now appear youthful before slowly getting to her feet. She walks toward the bathroom mirror, but the glass is completely fogged. As she wipes away the condensation, she freezes in disbelief. Staring back at her is a much younger version of herself. She immediately begins examining every part of her face and body, amazed by the dramatic transformation. Her excitement is interrupted when she turns around and sees Elizabeth still lying motionless on the floor. Following the instructions, she gathers the medical tools and carefully stitches Elizabeth's back together, fighting the urge to vomit while forcing herself to stay focused until the wound is completely sealed. Afterward, she prepares the special nutrient pack included with the product and inserts it into Elizabeth's body exactly as instructed. Later following morning, after taking a shower, she practices speaking confidently in front of the mirror. Suddenly, a sharp headache strikes, followed by a nosebleed. Remembering the instructions, she quickly reaches for the stabilizer and finally realizes what it is for. Shortly afterward, she inserts the long extraction needle into Elizabeth's back and begins drawing out spinal fluid, enduring the pain coursing through her body as she carefully completes the extraction. She quickly injects herself with the stabilizer. Almost instantly, the pain fades away. Not long afterward, she practices yoga in the living room. While stretching, she notices the casting advertisement from earlier and decides to give it a try. Soon after, at the audition, another contestant performs a lively dance routine, hoping to earn a spot, but the judges watch with little interest. Then she steps onto the stage. The judges are immediately captivated by her appearance and confident presence. Before introducing herself, moments later, Harvey personally comes to meet her. Impressed by her beauty, he hires her on the spot, and who then explains that every 2 weeks, she must leave town to care for her sick mother. He accepts the condition without hesitation. Over the following days, she begins taking part in photo shoots. She enjoys her daily routine while men around her can't help but stare as she walks past with growing confidence. Every day she relies on the stabilizer and continues training alongside the others as the show draws closer. Then, when she finally looks out the window feeling at peace, reality catches up with her. The time is up. She has to switch back to her original body. In preparation, she sets up a two-way IV line, carefully inserting it into both arms. The blood exchange begins successfully, and in an instant, she loses consciousness. Elizabeth awakens moments later, dazed and disoriented, as if she had just been hit by a bike. Still recovering, she prepares a simple meal for herself before heading out to the studio. There, Harvey grows increasingly impatient, clearly wanting her gone as quickly as possible. Back at home, she quickly organizes a strict schedule for herself and Sue, trying to keep everything under control. Days pass, and she slips back into routine life, but she can't stop obsessively checking the food matrix, waiting for the next switch. One morning, a notification from the company finally arrives, informing her that the package is ready for pickup. Without hesitation, she returns to the location and collects it. Eventually, it becomes Sue's turn again. While looking out at the view and enjoying the moment, she notices a commercial playing on TV, and her eyes land on the couch, something that instantly reminds her of her original body. So she starts scanning the empty space around her apartment, then discovers a hollow gap inside a bathroom wall. Without thinking twice, she begins smashing through it. However, the noise echoes through the building, causing a neighbor to storm over to complain. But the moment she opens the door, he's instantly struck by her beauty. His frustration fades, and instead of anger, he offers his assistance. She then drags Elizabeth's body into the secret room and carefully lays her there along with her portrait before closing the hidden door. Moments later, at the studio, Harvey is thrilled with Sue's performance as she dances energetically and flawlessly executes the choreography during the live show. Later that night, as Sue gets ready to go out, she visits Elizabeth, sarcastically telling her to wait patiently. She then notices that the food matrix is nearly empty, reminds her to eat slowly, and heads out with her new friend. Hours later, while making out with her boyfriend at home, the food matrix slowly runs dry, causing Elizabeth's body to twitch uncontrollably. At the same time, Sue suddenly realizes her time is up as her nose starts bleeding. She immediately rushes to the bathroom, locks the door, and checks on Elizabeth, only to discover that the food matrix has completely run dry. Standing in front of the mirror, holding back the pain, Sue comes up with an idea. She retrieves the discarded extraction container and prepares to draw more fluid. At first, she hesitates, but ultimately goes through with it. Ignoring the warning, she extracts more fluid and stabilizes herself. The next morning, Elizabeth wakes from a disturbing dream. She immediately checks Sue's back before putting on her coat and leaving the bathroom. As she steps into the living room, she finds the place in complete disarray. She then notices a note attached to the glass door. As she reaches for it, she is horrified to discover that one of her fingers has become old and deformed. Panicking, Elizabeth rushes to the sink and desperately tries to scrub it clean, but nothing changes. She then examines her back and realizes that Sue has taken more fluid than she was supposed to. Soon afterward, Elizabeth calls the company, desperately asking for a solution. However, the answer is far from what she hoped for before the representative abruptly hangs up. Frustrated, she crumples the note and throws the helmet outside before trying to distract herself by cleaning the apartment. While cleaning, she sees Sue's performance playing on television, which only fuels her anger, prompting her to switch it off. Moment later, Elizabeth prepared goes to collect a newly delivered package. Soon after picking it up, she hears someone calling her name. Terrified, she quickly walks away and slips into a nearby diner instead. She takes a seat but hesitates to remove her gloves. Moments later, an elderly man starts talking to her. Elizabeth notices a distinctive birthmark on his hand, identical to the one worn by the male nurse she met at the hospital. Then his wallet accidentally falls to the floor, revealing the same mysterious company card, along with a surgical scar running down his spine. As the old man continues questioning her, Elizabeth grows increasingly anxious. Unable to take it any longer, she abruptly leaves. Before she goes, the old man delivers one final warning, sending her rushing back home. On the way back, Elizabeth bumps into a young man carrying the helmet she had thrown away. He rudely tells her to watch where she's going before driving off. Shortly after, she enters the house and starts checking her belongings. She then finds the phone number Fred gave her earlier, making Elizabeth happy that someone still cares about her. Moments later, she calls him, and Fred is excited to hear from her. As they talk, they decide to go on a date. That night, Elizabeth starts getting ready for their date and carefully applies her makeup in front of the mirror. Before leaving, she plans to close the secret door, but then she notices Sue lying there. Looking at Sue's smooth skin and youthful face, she begins comparing herself to her reflection in the mirror. She applies even more makeup before leaving the bathroom. However, as she reaches for her keys, she notices a billboard featuring Sue. So she immediately returns to the bathroom and applies even more makeup before walking out once again. But just as she's about to open the front door, Sue's appearance lingers in her mind, and she can't stop comparing herself to her. In the end, Elizabeth goes back to the bathroom, rips off her makeup, and ruffles her hair in frustration. She never goes on the date. Ignoring Fred's messages, she sits silently on the bed before finally getting herself something to eat. The next day, Sue arrives at the studio and starts filming. As she moves in front of the camera, she suddenly notices a bump on her thigh, startling her, and immediately checks it before apologizing for being distracted. However, the crew notices something is wrong, so they replay the footage, making Sue anxious. She rudely asks someone to get her coat before rushing into the bathroom. There, she feels something inside her thigh and pushes it toward her belly button with her hand, then forces her hand inside, grabs it, and pulls it out while holding back the pain. It turns out to be only a dream. As she wakes up, Sue looks at Elizabeth's hand, which is still greasy. She then goes outside and sees a mess in the living room before cleaning it up. The next day, on the way to the studio, she calls the company to complain again, only to receive the same answer, leaving her annoyed. Minutes later, Sue arrives, only to find the studio empty. Someone then informs her that the manager wants to see her. As she nervously enters the office, Harvey turns around and teases her by saying she's fired. However, his next words leave her stunned and overjoyed when he offers her the biggest New Year's Eve show. Of course, she immediately agrees. Back at home, Sue explains to Elizabeth that she has received the opportunity of a lifetime before taking her spinal fluid, then takes even more, and even more, while excitedly explaining that she has appeared in a famous magazine. However, her back begins festering, forcing her to hold back her vomit throughout the process. The next day, Elizabeth wakes up screaming, only to discover that half of her body has already turned old and deformed. Moments later, she calls the company again to complain. That's when they offer to end the experience and explain that everything that has changed cannot be undone. However, she rejects the offer, so the representative hangs up after reminding her once again. Later that night, while watching TV, she looks at the gift from Harvey. However, as she tries to get to her feet, Elizabeth suddenly realizes she can't straighten her left leg, so she forces it while enduring the pain. She then tears open the wrapping and finds a cookbook inside, flipping through its pages. The moment she starts cooking, Sue appears on a talk show on TV, leaving Elizabeth annoyed. As she continues cooking, Sue talks about her experiences after being asked by the host, while Elizabeth keeps making irritated remarks. Then the host mentions Elizabeth on live TV, causing her to stop and watch closely while tightly gripping the chicken in anger. When Sue starts talking about Elizabeth's past performance, Elizabeth is enraged. She shoves her hand into the turkey while screaming at the TV. A moment later, she violently yanks out its innards. On screen, Sue continues explaining her fabricated life, her words only fueling Elizabeth's rage. Blinded by anger, Elizabeth starts violently mixing the eggs without control, sending them splattering everywhere and onto her face. Then, when Sue begins revealing her beauty secret on TV, Elizabeth can no longer hold herself back. She stands in front of the TV, angrily talking back while opening her robe, before throwing an egg at the television, then another at the window, which she eventually covers with newspaper. Shortly afterward in the bathroom, Elizabeth completely loses control. She talks to herself in the mirror while desperately trying to hold on to her sanity. Still struggling to regain control of her mind, she continues breaking down as she bathes. The next morning, Sue is enraged to find the house in a complete mess. The windows are entirely covered with newspaper, and dirty dishes are piled across the table. Furious, she decides she no longer wants to switch again. She gathers the glass containers beside Elizabeth's body, harshly plunges the needle into her back, and starts extracting spinal fluid. She pours it into the glass containers, and keeps repeating the process until all of the glass containers are full. 3 months later, with New Year's Eve approaching, Sue smiles as she looks at her poster outside the window. Moments later, a man arrives, hugs her, then invites her to bed. Before that, she goes to the bathroom to prepare another injection. Inside, Elizabeth lies surrounded by food matrix packs, including the food she would need if they switched. However, to her horror, there is no spinal fluid left, and she urgently needs more. She immediately calls the company, asking for a solution. The representative explains that she has drained it all and that the only way to obtain more is to switch again. However, she refuses, especially with the New Year's Eve show approaching. Suddenly, she collapses to the floor and begins crawling back toward the bathroom. She desperately reaches for the IV tubes before entering the secret room. At the same time, her boyfriend hears the noise and goes to investigate. Right then, Elizabeth struggles toward the bathroom door, closes it, and locks it. Meanwhile, Sue's boyfriend, confused by the noises, asks what is happening. Behind the door, Elizabeth's body has completely transformed into that of an old, deformed woman, as she stares at herself in the mirror. Furious, she shouts at him to leave, while Sue's boyfriend grows even more confused after hearing an unfamiliar voice. As Elizabeth continues struggling behind the door, the terrifying voice frightens him, causing him to quickly run out of the house. Moments later, Elizabeth comes out. However, as she walks, her legs can no longer support her weight, causing her to collapse. She struggles back to the living room, picks up the phone, and calls the company, deciding to end the experience. The next moment, Elizabeth struggles to drag her portrait across the floor. As she looks at it, she is overcome with regret. The next day, she covers her entire body as a notification from the company arrives, informing her that the package is ready for pickup. She then goes to collect it. Back at home, she drags Sue's body into the living room before opening the package and reading the retention message. She takes the termination syringe out of the box, then attaches the needle. However, just before injecting it, she hesitates after hearing a voice inside her head telling her otherwise. But Elizabeth steals her resolve and stabs the needle into Sue's body, slowly injecting the termination fluid. During the process, she notices a bouquet of flowers for Sue and starts remembering the days when she was famous. Filled with regret, she stops before giving Sue CPR, but instead the fluid begins flowing out of Sue's nose, so she grabs the IV tubes and starts switching with her. Right then, both of them suddenly wake up, stunned to see each other. When Sue notices the termination syringe on the floor, she immediately attacks her. As Elizabeth falls, Sue kicks her and starts choking her. Desperate, Elizabeth grabs a vase and smashes it over Sue's head before running into the bathroom with Sue chasing after her. Thankfully, she manages to lock the door. However, as she tries to block the door with a cabinet, Sue manages to burst into the bathroom, knocking her to the floor. As soon as Elizabeth gets back up, Sue kicks her again. She then grabs Elizabeth and repeatedly smashes her face into the mirror until blood covers her face. Despite her injuries, Elizabeth is still alive and manages to crawl back into the living room. That's when Sue kicks her away and continues kicking her until she's dead. Afterward, Sue is terrified as she looks at the blood covering her body. The next day at the studio, everyone gets ready for the show. However, Sue feels distracted. Soon after finishing her makeup, she suddenly feels sick and starts coughing. She excuses herself before rushing into the restroom. As she coughs, one of her teeth falls out as she quickly grabs it. Horrified, she slowly opens her mouth and realizes that all of her teeth are loose and can be pulled out with ease. Enraged, she suddenly remembers the activator and rushes back. However, Harvey calls her over and introduces her to the show's investors, who are eager to meet her. But Sue doesn't say a word, so Harvey simply asks her to smile. Moments later, a group of background dancers walks by, and Harvey and the investors follow them. As soon as they're gone, Sue immediately enters the elevator, but one of her fingernails comes loose as she presses the close button. As she removes it from her finger, one of her ears suddenly falls off as well. She avoids talking to the man who enters the elevator until he finally leaves. Moments later, Sue rushes back home as her vision begins to blur. She hurries into the bathroom, grabs the activator, reads the warning, and injects it into her body. While pleading in front of the mirror, her cells begin dividing uncontrollably. She collapses as her pupils multiply, and she screams in agony as her back splits open. Moments later, she wakes up in a daze with Sue's body lying beside her. She then sees her reflection in the mirror and realizes she has transformed into a monstrous creature, her body horribly deformed with multiple body parts fused together into one. A moment later, she sees Sue's poster outside the window and decides to go to the show. She forces herself into Sue's dress, slowly pierces earrings through both of her deformed ears, and tries to straighten her hair. She then removes Elizabeth's portrait from the wall, places it over her face, and applies lipstick to it before heading back to the studio. When she arrives, the staff waiting for her doesn't suspect anything. As she walks down the hallway, she imagines everyone gathering to congratulate her. Moments later, on stage, as everyone prepares and the audience eagerly waits, Harvey assures the investors that Sue is his best performer and promises they won't be disappointed. Moments later, the show begins live. As the spotlight shines on the center of the stage, Sue walks out. When the lights come on, everyone is left confused. She begins speaking into the microphone, but her voice is distorted and impossible to understand. Suddenly, the poster covering her face falls off. At that moment, a grotesque mass bursts out of her eye and drops onto the stage. Soon after, a woman in the audience screams. In an instant, everyone panics, and some people rush onto the stage, shoving Sue around until she falls to the ground. When she gets back up, someone strikes her with a microphone stand, causing her head to explode. However, another deformed head emerges from the remains. At the same time, one of her arms snaps apart, spraying blood across everyone nearby, covering both the audience and the stage. Everyone rushes out of the studio in terror. Moment later, as Sue tries to escape, one of her legs suddenly explodes, sending her crashing to the ground and her body completely bursts apart. However, her face continues struggling to move as it slowly crawls toward Elizabeth's Walk of Fame star, before melting into a pool of blood. The next morning, a janitor cleans it away with a walk-behind floor scrubber.